everyone, this is Trisha Thompson from Gluten-Free Watchdog. Thank you so much for tuning in. I'm going to be speaking about labeled gluten-free foods, including what we are seeing in terms of gluten levels, cross-contact, and facial misbranding. For those of you who are tuning in who have never heard of Gluten-Free Watchdog, we are a consumer advocacy group. We were founded to independently test foods for gluten and to make state-of-the-art food testing data available to consumers. We also file product complaints on behalf of consumers to the Food and Drug Administration and the U.S. Department of Agriculture when products are misbranded. We are a consumer and subscriber-driven organization, and they are our one and only concern. The focus of this presentation will be lessons learned from 16 years of testing food for gluten. The positive news is that the vast majority of the hundreds of foods tested through Gluten-Free Watchdog have tested below 20 parts per million of gluten. There have been a few unwelcome surprises over the years, including the level of cross-contact in lentils and the number of products impacted by facial misbranding. We've also learned through direct experience that testing for gluten is far from straightforward. As we go through all of these issues in detail, gluten levels, cross-contact, facial misbranding, and testing, please don't get discouraged. Please remember that most manufacturers of gluten-free foods are doing it right. So looking first at gluten levels in gluten-free foods, when I say the vast majority of manufacturers of labeled gluten-free foods are doing it right, what exactly do I mean? We have tested hundreds of foods labeled gluten-free. The last time we crunched the numbers, 87% tested below 5 parts per million of gluten, and 96% tested below 20 parts per million of gluten. This means that only 4% of foods tested at or above 20 parts per million of gluten. So you may be thinking that this is still too high, and of course we should strive for 100% compliance, but 96% compliance is pretty darn good. When products do test out of compliance, they tend to be grain foods. This finding is not all that surprising, given that this category of food is susceptible to gluten cross-contact. When we look at the foods testing at or above 20 parts per million of gluten, a whopping 79% of them are grain foods. Remember, though, that only 4% of all foods tested through Gluten-Free Watchdog are out of compliance. The vast majority of foods, including grain foods, test below 20 parts per million of gluten. The photo on this slide is millet, and the darker grains in the photo are barley. This photo was taken during a study assessing grains for gluten cross-contact. We were getting results above 20 parts per million on this sample of millet, and we were curious about the source of cross-contact. After removing the millet from product packaging, it was relatively easy to spot the foreign grain. Of the grain-based foods testing out of compliance, 45% of them are oat products. This finding also is not surprising, given the likelihood of gluten cross-contact in oats specifically. But again, remember that only 4% of foods are testing out of compliance. Of that small percentage, the vast majority are grain foods, and of these grain foods, about half are oats. So what should you do about grains in your gluten-free diet? It is highly recommended that you buy naturally gluten-free grains and flours that are labeled gluten-free. This is important because unintentional cross-contact with gluten-containing grain can occur anywhere along the production line, including while being grown, harvested, stored, transported, processed, and packaged. So what are the recommendations for oats specifically? Eat only those oat products that are labeled gluten-free. This is an exceedingly important recommendation to follow. Standard oats are highly likely to contain errant wheat or barley grain, as you can see from the table. The oats tested were standard oats. Levels of gluten varied widely between brands and within brands, with levels ranging from below the limit of detection to almost 1900 parts per million. These test results are in keeping with what we know about oats and cross-contact. It is very, very spotty. While this study was done 16 years ago, it is unlikely that much has changed in terms of foreign grain in standard oats. This study was done around the same time that farmers in Canada and the US were developing a gluten-free purity protocol for oats to, quote, solve the oat problem. At Gluten-Free Watchdog, we remain supportive of the use of purity protocol oats by folks with celiac disease and other gluten-related disorders. Generally speaking, we are not supportive of the use of sorted oats, those oats that undergo a sorting process to remove errant grain at the back end of production. When the data was last reviewed, 14% of oat products labeled gluten-free and tested through Gluten-Free Watchdog contained a level of gluten at or above 20 parts per million. Based on conversations with the manufacturers of these products, either standard oats or sorted oats were being used. In other words, these manufacturers were not using purity protocol oats at the time of testing. Turning our attention now to lentils, one of the unwelcome surprises we've had over the years is the level of gluten cross-contact we've encountered in lentils. We've received numerous consumer complaints about many brands, including labeled gluten-free and certified gluten-free varieties. Gluten-Free Watchdog has filed complaints with the FDA, and fortunately, the latest complaint did result in a recall. We also received the occasional complaint about foreign grain in other legumes, but nothing compares to the number of complaints received for lentils. The lentils pictured in this slide are just two of the consumer photos we've received. The number of foreign grain in lentils varies greatly. Sometimes a bag of lentils contains 1 or 2 errant grains. Other times, bags contain so much foreign grain that I have no idea how the manufacturer isn't aware of the problem. It isn't always easy for someone who isn't a farmer to determine the type of grain found in a bag of lentils. Sometimes, to make sure we are looking at gluten-containing grains, the foreign material is sent to the lab for testing. Here is the lab report for gluten testing on errant grain from 1 bag of lentils. Results suggest that the foreign material was comprised of a mixture of gluten-containing and non-gluten-containing grain. The brand of lentils in this photo was reported to FDA by Gluten-Free Watchdog, and fortunately, it was recalled. I personally sorted through this bag of lentils and was shocked by the amount of foreign grain. So what are the recommendations for lentils? It is highly recommended that you pour dry lentils onto a cookie sheet or another flat surface and pick through them very carefully, removing any foreign material. It is also recommended that you thoroughly rinse dry lentils or canned lentils under running water. If a particular brand of lentils contains more than a few errant grains or consistently contains foreign material, you really may want to consider using another brand. So you might be wondering if this strategy really works to remove gluten. There is some evidence to support what I call the pick through and rinse approach. A bag of lentils containing foreign grain was sent by a UK blogger to research scientist Adrian Rogers for testing. A sample of lentils was taken from the bag and ground. It tested at 7 parts per million of gluten. A second sample of lentils was picked through and foreign material removed. The picked through lentils were thoroughly washed and then ground. There was no quantifiable gluten in this sample of lentils. The rinse water was also tested and found to contain low levels of gluten. This suggests that the rinsing procedure removed at least some of the gluten present in the sample. What the community desperately needs is purity protocol lentils, similar to what we have for oats. The good news is that there are companies that have purity protocol lentils available, but they are not yet commercially available for consumers. As soon as they become available, we will let you know. Let's switch gears a bit and talk about another unwelcome surprise we've encountered at Gluten-Free Watchdog, the prevalence of what we call facial misbranding. We use this term to describe products that are labeled gluten-free, yet include an ingredient not allowed in foods labeled gluten-free. Facial misbranding tends to involve the same ingredients appearing in labeled gluten-free foods over and over again. When we come across facial misbranding, chances are good that the culprit will be a barley malt ingredient such as malt extract, malt syrup, or malt vinegar, or a wheat-based soy sauce. So let's run through a few examples of facial misbranding. To the best of my knowledge, these products remain in the marketplace and have not been recalled. This first photo is of an instant beverage that is labeled gluten-free, yet the ingredient, extracts of roasted barley and rye, is included in the ingredients list. We've been reporting this product to FDA for years. This photo is of a protein powder labeled gluten-free, yet the ingredient germinated barley seed powder is included in the ingredients list. This product has also been reported to FDA on multiple occasions. This photo is of a marinade that is labeled gluten-free, yet wheat is included as a sub-ingredient of the soy sauce. This photo is of a supplement that is labeled gluten-free, yet the first ingredient is malt syrup. In the US, the ingredient malt syrup is by definition barley malt syrup unless another source of malt is named. And finally, this photo is of a sweetener labeled gluten-free, yet the ingredient malt extract is included in the ingredients list. In the US, the ingredient malt extract is by definition barley malt extract unless another source of malt is named. All of these products have been reported to FDA, but all of them remain in the marketplace. The good news is that in August, the FDA published a rule for gluten-free labeling of fermented and hydrolyzed foods and ingredients. It is hoped that the publication of this rule will lead to fewer facially misbranded products. As part of the rule release, FDA clarified their position on malt ingredients. We've been asking them to do this for years, but they advised us that they would wait until the rule was published. True to their word, thank goodness, in a rule Q&A, FDA writes, quote, "Food and ingredient manufacturers should be aware that malt extract and other similar malt-derived ingredients are ingredients derived from gluten-containing grains that have not been processed to remove gluten and therefore cannot be used in foods that bear a gluten-free labeling claim," unquote. While this statement could not be clearer, Gluten-Free Watchdog recently dealt with a manufacturer of a labeled gluten-free food containing barley malt extract. To date, the product has not been recalled. FDA also clarified their position on wheat-based soy sauce. This is another ingredient we've been asking FDA to clarify for years. In the same rule Q&A, FDA writes, quote, "In general, when soy sauce is made from soybeans and wheat or any other gluten-containing grain, it may not bear a gluten-free claim," unquote. So what is the consumer's role in combating facial misbranding? It is recommended that you continue to read ingredients lists even when a food is labeled gluten-free. You shouldn't have to do this. The whole point of the gluten-free labeling rule was to allow consumers to simply look for a gluten-free claim. If you do come across a product you believe to be facially misbranded, you may want to alert the manufacturer, the certifying organization if there is one, and the overseeing agencies such as FDA or USDA. If you run into any difficulties, please do not hesitate to reach out to Gluten-Free Watchdog. Before we move on from facial misbranding, I'd like to talk briefly about a labeling issue that consumers perceive to be misbranding when actually it isn't. An allergen advisory statement for wheat, also known as a may contain statement or precautionary allergen labeling, on a food labeled gluten-free is the most frequent complaint we receive at Gluten-Free Watchdog. When a label includes both a gluten-free claim and a precautionary allergen advisory statement for wheat, the food is not facially misbranded. Allergen advisory statements such as processed in the same facility as wheat, may contain wheat, or processed on the same lines as wheat pertain to manufacturing practices and are meant to inform the allergen community. These statements are voluntary and they do not fall under any federal regulation, at least in the US. Some manufacturers use them, many do not. These statements are allowed on foods making gluten-free claims. Regardless of the presence or absence of an allergen advisory statement, foods bearing a gluten-free claim must be in compliance with gluten-free labeling rules. The photo on the slide is an example of an allergen advisory statement for wheat. The product is certified gluten-free. The statement, produced in a facility that processes wheat, is also included on the label. This is the type of labeling frequently reported to Gluten-Free Watchdog. Consumers are generally very surprised to learn that products bearing both statements are allowed. While allergen advisory statements for wheat might be allowed on foods making gluten-free claims, consumers remain skeptical about their safety. The question then becomes, do foods with allergen advisory statements for wheat contain higher levels of gluten than foods without such a claim? To help answer that question, we retrospectively reviewed the data for 328 labeled gluten-free products tested through Gluten-Free Watchdog for the presence of an allergen advisory statement for wheat on product packaging. 31 of the 328 products included an allergen advisory statement for wheat on product packaging. Of these 31 products, 29 contained less than 20 parts per million of gluten. So only 2 products were out of compliance with the allowed level of gluten. We also looked at the gluten levels of all 328 products. 14 contained a level of gluten at or above 20 parts per million. Only 2 of these 14 products included an allergen advisory statement for wheat. In other words, 12 products testing at or above 20 parts per million of gluten did not include an allergen advisory statement for wheat. The bottom line is that consumers should not make gluten-free purchasing decisions based solely on the presence or absence of an allergen advisory statement for wheat. The next issue we will be covering is testing. This discussion may get into the weeds a bit, so please bear with me. The bottom line is that testing is complicated. It isn't as simple as purchasing a product, sending it to the lab, and waiting for results. The assay used, the extraction method used, the weight amount of sample that's homogenized, the weight amount of extractions tested, all depend in large part on the ingredients in the product. So let's look at a sample product that Gluten-Free Watchdog actually sent to the lab, and I will walk you through a bit of the process used to decide what testing to request. The first question to ask is what assay should be used: the sandwich or competitive ELISA, or both. The sandwich ELISA quantifies intact gluten protein. The competitive ELISA is intended to detect protein that has been broken apart into smaller fragments. As I look at the ingredients list, nothing jumps out at me to suggest we should test the product with the competitive. It is likely that any gluten present will be intact, so the sandwich ELISA should be requested. The second question to ask is whether the product contains any ingredients that contain high levels of tannins or polyphenols. The answer impacts the extraction process. Looking at this product, chocolate is an ingredient and chocolate contains tannins. As a consequence, the extraction process must include a milk additive per the recommendation of the assay manufacturer. The milk additive helps guard against false positives and false negatives. The next question to ask is whether the product contains oats as one of the main ingredients. The answer impacts the weight amount of sample homogenized and the weight amount of extractions tested. Looking at the ingredients list, this product contains oats. This means the lab should be asked to follow the oat testing protocol recommended by the assay manufacturer. This means a larger sample size will be ground and larger extraction amounts will be tested. This is done because gluten cross-contact is spotty in oats, meaning any gluten present will not be evenly distributed. The larger the sample tested, the greater the likelihood any gluten present will be detected. Another question to ask is whether the product contains any enzymes or bacteria. Looking at the ingredients list, the answer is no. If the answer had been yes, then the enzymes or bacteria would have to be neutralized prior to testing to prevent a false positive result. So these are just a few of the considerations that go into the testing request we make when we send product to the lab. So what happens when a product arrives at the lab? When it is ready for testing, a representative 50-gram sample of product is ground and homogenized in a blender or coffee grinder. This is done to hopefully evenly distribute any gluten present in the sample. Unfortunately, when it comes to evenly distributing gluten, there is the pesky issue of spotty cross-contact. As mentioned earlier, gluten isn't evenly distributed within a product. I tried to represent heterogeneous cross-contact with these crackers. For this photo, I put some red sugar sprinkles on a paper towel and then placed rice crackers on top of them. When I flipped them over, some crackers or sections of crackers had more sprinkles than others. It might be helpful to think of the red sprinkles as representing breadcrumbs that might be on a surface used to prepare gluten-free food. After the representative sample has been homogenized, at least 2 extractions are tested from this ground sample. This is done because testing more than one extraction helps determine whether the sample was sufficiently homogenized. Some samples are more difficult to homogenize than others, and it doesn't matter how much grinding is done. Imagine trying to evenly distribute a single wheat kernel in 50 grams of lentils. When testing is completed, results are reported out as parts per million of gluten. I'd like to spend a little time discussing parts per million because this concept causes a lot of consumer confusion. So what exactly is meant by parts per million of gluten? There are 2 issues that appear to cause the most confusion. First, parts per million is a proportion. How many parts out of 1 million parts is gluten? But knowing this level isn't the end of the story. To know how many milligrams of gluten you might consume from a particular food, you need to know 2 numbers, the part per million gluten level and the weight amount of the food consumed. The second issue that is important to understand is that parts per million isn't additive. Eating 2 1-ounce slices of bread containing 20 parts per million of gluten doesn't mean 40 parts per million of gluten was eaten, but it does mean that about 1 milligram of gluten was eaten. As mentioned, Knowing just the parts per million level doesn't tell the whole story. So let's try to put parts per million into perspective. If a product, any product, contains a level of gluten of 20 parts per million, then each 28 gram or 1 ounce amount eaten will contain a little over 1/2 milligram of gluten. I recorded a video a couple years ago and I weighed out 28 gram portions of a variety of products. In the screenshots I'm about to show you, each bag contains a 28 gram amount of product. If each of the products contains a level of gluten of 20 parts per million, the amount in the bag is the amount that would have to be eaten to ingest 1/2 milligram of gluten. This first screenshot includes a bag of cereal. The weight amount of cereal in the bag is 28 grams or 1 ounce. If this cereal contains a level of gluten of 20 parts per million, this is the amount of cereal that would have to be eaten to ingest 1/2 milligram of gluten. This amount of cereal or even more is relatively easy to eat. This next screenshot includes a bag of dry pasta. Again, the weight amount of pasta in the bag is 28 grams or 1 ounce. If this pasta contains a level of gluten of 20 parts per million, then this is the amount of pasta that would have to be eaten to ingest 1/2 milligram of gluten. As was the case with cereal, this amount of pasta or even more is relatively easy to eat. This next screenshot includes a bag of cornmeal. The same math applies. If you eat this amount of cornmeal with a part per million level of 20, you will ingest 1/2 milligram of gluten. Look closely at this next screenshot. The bag contains 28 grams or 1 ounce of spice. This is the amount of spice you would have to eat to take in 1/2 milligram of gluten if the spice had a gluten level of 20 parts per million. Unlike grain foods such as pasta or cereal, we typically do not eat spices in 1 ounce portions. We are far more likely to use just a pinch of spice. So I am far more concerned when a grain food tests at, say, 40 parts per million gluten than when a spice tests at 40 parts per million gluten. Again, this is because of the typical amount eaten. The last screenshot includes a bag of over-the-counter medication. The amount of medication in this bag weighs 1 ounce. Look at the number of pills in this bag. You would have to ingest all of these pills to take in 1/2 milligram of gluten if the medication contained a level of gluten of 20 parts per million. This is why, generally speaking, I am not as concerned about low levels of gluten in medications as I am about low levels of gluten in grain foods. So to briefly summarize parts per million, while all foods labeled gluten-free should contain a level of gluten below 20 parts per million, it is far more concerning when foods typically eaten in ounces test above 20 parts per million than when foods typically consumed in very small amounts test above 20 parts per million gluten. The same logic applies to medications. To briefly summarize what we've been discussing during this presentation, remember, most manufacturers of gluten-free foods are doing it right. Only 4% of gluten-free foods are testing at or above 20 parts per million of gluten. This is not perfect, and there is definitely room for improvement, but this is pretty darn good. Also, due to the risk of cross-contact, choose naturally gluten-free grains and flours that are labeled gluten-free whenever possible. Choose only those oat products that are labeled gluten-free, and in my opinion, it is best to choose oat products produced following a purity protocol, and make sure to sort through and rinse lentils. And last, due to continuing issues with facial misbranding, Read ingredient lists of foods labeled gluten-free. Thank you so much for listening to this entire presentation. If you have any questions, please do not hesitate to reach out to me. I can always add some clarification to a particular slide, or I can add Q&A slides to the end of this presentation. Thank you so much.